So we're back. And today what we're going to do is we're going to take the two boxes that we created in our last demo and we're going to create lids for them. With this one, we're going to create the lid from the top of the container. And with the other one, we're going to create a lid that fits to the top of the container. So here we go. All right, so again, with this box, we're going to make the lid from the top. And you can see I've already got a line going around the outside. What I did was simply measure from the bottom up to a particular height. Marked it off all the way around and then drew the line just to make sure that everything lined up. And so now I'm ready to cut it. To do that, what I'm going to need is my ruler, my straight edge, and instead of using a needle, I'm going to use an X-Acto knife. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my straight edge, my ruler, and I'm going to lay that right along the line that I've drawn, and I'm going to cut it with my X-Acto knife. I don't want to cut through in one pass. I want to make a few passes and go a little bit at a time so I get a nice clean cut. The corners are the tricky part, so you want to work your blade down in gradually and then nice and slow right along that edge. When you get to the corner, don't pull the knife through. Work it down in there gently. If you pull it through, it's likely to chip that corner out. And just take your time. Patience is really important with this part of the process. We don't want to waste all that time that we put into building the container, making it nice and clean, and so forth by rushing the lid. Okay, so I've made it through that panel, and now I'll rotate it and work my way around. And there's our lid. If we look at the lid, we can see that the interior joint didn't get luted when we put it together. Since the clay is still damp, I want to take an opportunity to, one, clean that up, and two, add a very thin coil along that inside edge to make sure that it doesn't crack. Okay, so I'm cleaning up this interior corner here. But I also want to point out, if you look at the edge that was created along here when I cut the lid, that's a sharp edge that if I leave it like that, it's going to chip really easily. So I also want to come back along and soften that, but I want to be really careful not to mess or disturb the outside edge here, right? Because if I remove or add clay, it won't fit back down on the box the way that it did when I cut it off of there. All right, so you can see here that there's no edge or flange on the lid or the box to hold the lid in place. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a flange to the inside edge just by cutting some thin strips of clay, scoring, adding slurry, repeating, and joining it like we would any two pieces of clay. Once I get it on there, then I have to clean up very carefully this inside edge here so that it'll fit back down inside the box. I want to be cautious that I don't scrape or remove clay from the face of the lid where it hits the top of the box. Otherwise, it won't fit properly. And you should know that once you put that on, if you try to set the lid on the box while the slurry is still wet, it's likely that it may stick forever. So be cautious about that. Okay, so I'm adding my last layer of slurry to the flange for my lid. You can see that I've added slurry here already. And now I'll just fit it into place. And as I join it, again, I want to wiggle it back and forth, up and down, swirl it around, whatever you need to do to make sure that you're achieving particle alignment. Then I will come back immediately very carefully remove the excess slurry. I will definitely need to do further cleanup there, but it's certainly helpful to remove that really soft, wet slurry right away. Okay, and then you're gonna have some little gaps here and there. So at this point, we'll go ahead and fill those in. And we'll let it dry a little bit before we try to fit it perfectly back to the box. Okay, so you can see we've put the finishing touches on our flange, got it cleaned up, and see how it fits. Right, just like it's supposed to. So next, some kind of a handle and perhaps some feet or legs. Okay, so here we are with our other box. We finished the lid on the first box. So now I want to do a different lid for this box. I'm going to cut the top and create an opening. And to do that, I have a template. I don't have to use a template, but a template's nice. That way I can lay it on here and kind of visualize, first of all, the proportions of the opening to the rest of the box. I can lay it on there and make sure that it lines up with all of my edges. And you can see that I've just very lightly drawn an X from corner to corner. And then if I take my template and I lay it on there at each of those points, that should square it off fairly well. And I never cut anything without looking at it first. So I will just scribe a very light line all the way around. And then I'll have a much better idea of whether or not I want that size opening for my container or something different. I like what I have, so I'll go on to the next step. Okay, so what I've done here is I've drawn another square inside of the first square that I drew. And what these two lines or squares indicate is where the flange for this box will be. And you'll understand what that means more in a few minutes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to carve this material not out completely, but halfway or 2/3 of the way down so that there's a recess there. And then I'll remove this part completely and I'll have a ledge or a flange for my lid to sit on. Okay, now before I carve anything, I want to use this fettling knife to define that outside line a little bit further And what I'll have here is a little deeper, wider mark for the tool that I'm going to be carving with to work within, in the hopes that I don't ding that outside edge up. The inside edge is not a big deal. I'll be removing it anyhow. But if I open this up a little bit further, it's kind of like pre-carving if you ever carved in a piece of wood. If I do this first, I'm kind of creating and establishing a real clean outer perimeter before I start using any carving tools, and that'll make it easier to keep it nice and clean all the way through. So now I'll take this small ribbon tool and I will remove this material, again, not all the way through, about 1/2 to 2/3 of the total thickness, and that'll leave me a ledge there. And now, based on the thickness of the tool, I can just drop it down in there and remove that last little strip and have a really clean edge there, as you can see, to work with. Now, if I want to go deeper, I can. It's not a bad idea to have a piece of your slab laying around so you have a gauge of your thickness to kind of work with, something to judge that against. I still have plenty of clay there that I can remove, so I can make my recess sit down a little bit further. My flange will sit a bit lower and my lid will be more secure once it's set on top of the box. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm using this clay shaper to clean up the scuff marks from carving that flange out. So the clay body has grog in it, and when you draw the tool through there, it scuffs it up a bit. And you probably don't want to leave it that way, but I don't want to try to clean that up after I remove this, because that's going to be a real thin edge that can very easily snap off there if I put too much pressure on it. So if I do it now, I can get it pretty clean, meaning smooth, and then I can come back and fine tune it if I need to. So the last step here for creating the opening is to remove this part. And I will do that with my X-Acto knife. I'll lay a straight edge on the interior line, and I'll just slowly cut through that. Shouldn't take much. I'll make a few passes, again, so the line is nice and clean, and I'll just work my way around. Okay, now, I don't want this thing to fall through and maybe bend this up before I cut it. So if I take my needle and drop it in at an angle, like so, it'll hold that side up, hopefully, while I do this last cut. And voila. Now, inevitably, you're going to have some cleanup work to do. It's very easy. Just take your ribbon tool and very carefully trim that material away. Okay, now it's time to make the lid. Unfortunately, I have a template right here that I can use to do that. Okay, so picking up where we left off, I have my box here. I've cut the opening. I have the flange ready to go. Here's my template. If you recall, my template is a fit for the lid itself. And now I can use that to have kind of a jumping off point in terms of what type of lid I want. Okay, and so what you need to know is we have options. So we saw one type of lid with the other box, right? The lid that fits down over the top, right? Here we're going to have a lid that sits into this flange or into this recess on a flange. And the question I need to ask myself is, do I want it to sit flat? Do I want it to have somewhat of a dome to it? Does it have some kind of a texture? You know, all these different things that I want to think about, not only in terms of function, but the aesthetic aspects of it, right? And so those are some things that we'll experiment with. So first thing I have here is just a flat slab that I could very easily just simply lay my template on, and if I cut that out, now I have a piece of clay that fits perfectly into my opening. That's a little bit boring, but there's nothing wrong with that. I may come up with some kind of a very sculptural decorative element for the knob, wherein a flat top would be perfectly acceptable. And a variation on that would be something like this, perhaps, right? Where it's a slab that I've cut simply with a spring. It's got a little texture to it. There's a pattern there that I could work with. That also could be just flat. And if I lay my template on there and cut it out, boom, I have a lid. But maybe in this particular case, I want to experiment with something else. And what I have here is just a piece of wood that I've cut and shaped into a nice little pillow top, right? Which would make a pretty neat lid for that box. And whether I use the textured slab or a smooth slab is really up to me. Okay, and that's just a couple potential variations that we might explore today. Okay, all right. So if I were to use this textured slab, right, the question I probably want to ask is, how do I form that over that without messing up my texture? And the answer is very carefully. So I'll just gently press this down. When you're working with stuff like this, avoiding using your fingertips is usually a good idea. You want to use the pads of your fingers, and then also the palm of your hand. That's going to be really helpful in terms of maintaining the texture and not having depressions where your fingerprints were. Okay, so now that I've kind of pressed that down, I can simply cut what I know to be excess material off, just to make it easier to work with. And then the question is, do I even want that texture for my lid? And the fact of the matter is that at this point, I'm not sold on it. But you won't know unless you experiment with these kinds of things, and that's the purpose of what I'm doing. I like the shape, but I'm not sure that the texture is right. So now we'll try it with a smooth slab. And just like that, I have the shape that I want. Now I just need to trim it. Okay. So again, cleaning it up, fine-tuning it. So what's going to happen next? I do need to think about shrinkage here. This slab is quite a bit damper than the box, so if I let it sit for a bit, it will shrink and it'll be a closer fit, and then I can fine tune it. So that's what I'll do. Okay, so I've trimmed and fine tuned the slab that we pressed over our little hump mold, and now it's time to set it in place and see how well it fits. It fits pretty nicely. Okay. And we're good to go. Now, what I need to do is come up with some kind of a handle or a knob for this. It's not a very practical lid in terms of being able to pick it up the way that it is. It looks nice. I like the way that it works with the container, right? But I need something here. And for me, this is where the fun starts. This is where I get to experiment and play and find that thing that really works, right? Okay, so now that I've kind of decided what the handle of this particular lid's going to be, I want to let it dry a bit before I attach it, because this is drier than the clay that I made the handle from. I don't want the handle to shrink later and come loose. So if I cover this up, let this dry some, it'll shrink, and then I put them together when I have equal moisture content. Okay, so one of the things I also want to talk about is feet or legs, right? And sometimes we don't know whether or not we want to put feet or legs on these containers, and I think rather than going through all of the work of making 4 legs or feet and sticking them on and then finding that you don't really like it, I think it's a good idea just to kind of simply just take 4 wads of clay and stick them on there. And the idea is to just look at what happens when you have some negative space underneath your form, right? And in this particular case, I think that that would look really good to elevate it a little bit. Obviously, these are just tester feet to kind of see what it would look like with some negative space underneath it. And I like it. I like it a lot. What I need to do now is go through the same process that I went through with the elements for the handles and experiment and explore a little bit until I find what works for me, which is what I recommend you do as well. All right, so here we are. We're finished building. Our boxes are in their kind of final greenware state. What you should know is that the sculptural elements, the handles, the feet, the legs, were all built separate from the containers, joined, assembled, cleaned up, and then dried to the same level of moisture as the boxes before they were joined. That way everything can shrink together rather than apart.